Joining me now, right here on set, retired Admiral James Stavridis, MSNBC Chief International Security and Diplomacy Analyst and former Supreme Allied Commander of NATO. Thank you very much, Admiral Stavridis, for being here.
Thanks, Jonathan. Great to be with you.
So explain why the United States and NATO won't grant Zelensky's call for a no-fly zone over Ukraine.
Simply put, because it would put American pilots, NATO pilots going nose to nose with Russian pilots in a combat situation. That is a path to escalation and potential war of a scale that would dwarf anything happening. Here's what we should do, Jonathan. We should be providing the Ukrainians the means to enforce a no-fly zone of their own. More missiles, more high-altitude missiles, and above all, let's get these NATO jets turned over, these MiG-29s, from Poland to Ukraine.
You know, in one of the videos that President Zelensky put out, I mean, he was very clear in saying, if you don't give us a no-fly zone and you don't give us fighter jets, then you want us to die slowly. How does the NATO alliance and the world react to that?
Hopefully with strong action to include transferring these MiG-29s. These are very capable jets. They were built by the Russians, but they were part of the Polish armed forces. And the Ukrainian pilots have flown that jet. They know how to do it. And what the required step, Jonathan, is for the U.S. to backfill the Polish jets when they're turned over to the Ukrainians. It could be a game changer in the skies over Ukraine.
You know, there's a fine line, a tightrope that the United States and the NATO alliance are walking. And David Ignatius writes about this, the paradox facing the United States today in the Washington Post. He writes, stop the Russians without fighting them, check Putin's aggression, but give him a way out before the situation gets any more dangerous. How long, Admiral, can the United States walk this fine line? And does Putin even want a way out?
As to whether Putin wants a way out, we're going to have to turn over a few more cards. And I'll tell you this, the more Russian body bags go home to Moscow, the more likely he is to want to find a climb down here. What we need to do is to provide the Ukrainians the means to fight: anti-armor, anti-air, intelligence, cyber overwatch. We need to slam Putin with heavy hitter sanctions, I would argue, to include oil and gas. And above all, we need to continue to rally the NATO alliance, move our forces to the border, continue that flow of military equipment into Ukraine.
But those military forces have been moving to the border, the western flank in Ukraine. Is there an explanation for why the Russians have not unleashed an aerial assault on Ukraine or even on Kiev in particular?
Well, first of all, they are upping those kind of strikes, which, let's call it what it is. These are war crimes. When you blow up residences, you attack hospitals, you attack a nuclear power plant, they're increasing it. But why they have not thus far? A, because the Ukrainians have weapons, which we've provided. That is creating deterrence. And B, Russian logistics, as we've seen, is not fully supportive of the kind of all-out war campaign. I don't think they're capable as yet of doing this. So we still have a window to get these weapons in the hands of Ukrainians. Let them create this no-fly zone. They can do it.
And so what you just said about logistics, Russians and the logistics, does that explain that 40-mile convoy that seems to be stuck in place for almost a week now?
Yeah, I call that 40-mile convoy, by the way, the biggest, fattest target in Ukraine. Put those MiG-29s in the hands of the Ukrainians and watch that thing blow up. And yes, it is logistic shortfalls. It's also bad generalship and bad leadership as the Russians came in on too many axes, plus they underestimated the spirit, the fighting spirit of the Ukrainians and President Zelensky.
And I think he probably underestimated the alliance, the NATO alliance. So you spoke to the New York Times and you said the global system was built in the 1950s. And if you think of it as a car from those years, it is battered, out of date in some ways, and could use a good tune-up. But it is still on the road, rolling along. And ironically enough, Vladimir Putin has done more in a week to energize it than anything I can remember.
Indeed. And let me give you a very practical reminiscence in that regard. I spent 4 years as Supreme Allied Commander of NATO. At every conference, every meeting of high-level NATO officials, I would find my way to Chancellor Angela Merkel of Germany and the Minister of Defense, Ursula von der Leyen, and I would say to them, you've got to raise your defense spending. And I got nowhere in 4 years. In 48 hours, Vladimir Putin has inspired the Germans to effectively nearly double their defense budget, a smart move on the part of Germans. Vladimir Putin may be the best thing that ever happened to the NATO alliance.
Speaking of Vladimir Putin, let's play some sound from yesterday in an odd statements, only because I think this is the one where he's surrounded by Aeroflot flight attendants.
Yeah.
And there are some irresponsible statements that they should create a no-fly zone over the territory of Ukraine. It's impossible to do, but any move in that direction will be considered by us as a participation of that country in the military action. That very second, we will consider them as members, as participants of this conflict. And it doesn't matter what members of what alliances they are. So I understand. I'm hoping that this will not come to it.
Admiral, how seriously do you take that threat from Vladimir Putin? Because he's been issuing threats since he against the alliance and against the West, against the world, since he invaded Ukraine.
I take it seriously. He does have nuclear capability, but my assessment is he is highly unlikely to want to use a nuclear weapon for a wide variety of obvious reasons. When you end up in a conventional conflict, the NATO alliance outspends Russia 15-1. We have a 4-1 advantage in ground troops. We have a 5-1 advantage in combat aircraft, a 6-1 advantage in warships. He's not going to pick a fight with the NATO alliance. He is trying to transmit a period of strength. And by the way, how unsettling is that set of images of him with flowers and teapots and flight crew while Ukrainians are being pushed across borders, 1.5 million refugees? That is an out-of-touch leader.
We have run out of time, but I've got to ask you about the op-ed in the New York Times from British Prime Minister Boris Johnson, who laid out a 6-point plan from his perspective to help Ukraine. The first one being mobilize an international humanitarian coalition, do more to help Ukraine to defend itself, which you've talked about, maximize the economic pressure on Putin's regime, prevent any normalization of what Russia does in Ukraine, be open to diplomacy and de-escalation, strengthen Euro-Atlantic security. Real quickly, that fourth point, prevent any normalization of what Russia does in Ukraine. How vital is that?
It's crucial. And again, we haven't seen behavior like this between nations since the 1930s. And if we normalize it, the cascade effect of authoritarian states crossing borders to conquer territories will thrust us back to the times of the ancient Romans. We don't want to go there.
How concerned are you that Putin won't stop at Ukraine?
I'm quite concerned. I don't think he'll attack a NATO nation, but he's got his gun sights on Moldova, on Kazakhstan, on Belarus, on these other nations, sovereign nations who were at one time part of the Soviet Union. That's where he goes next. I worry about that a lot.
You didn't mention the Baltics.
They are NATO members, and personally,
right.
I don't believe he would cross a NATO border in anger because the correlation of military force is so deeply against him.